The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for your attendance. My name is Doug Morris. I'm the Strategy Director at Ratio Squared. We are a digital agency based in London in the UK. And what we want to talk to you about today is some ideas around scaling experimentation programs. When we start working with a number of different clients, they perhaps have managed to perform some A/B tests, but nothing that is really transforming the way that they're doing business online. And so we want to look at the factors that you can control in order to really scale up, for example, from 10 tests a year to 500 tests a year. So the first thing that I want to discuss is having a perspective on your optimization program that extends beyond one individual test or series of tests. And that is, what KPIs can you put into place that will let you understand how the program as a whole is performing, as opposed to just one test? So it can be very easy to focus on the wins or losses or insights that we're getting from individual tests, but merely looking at the results of one test at a time won't help us to understand whether we are maximizing the opportunities that we have available to us from an experimentation point of view. It won't help us understand where the levers are for us to pull and to optimize the program itself in order to drive greater performance. And so really we need to be considering, to use an old expression, the wood, not just the trees. So the first metric I want to talk about that we help our clients to implement and to monitor is test capacity. Now, you could imagine that all else equal, that is, provided that the quality of your tests remains the same, the more that you experiment, the more results and learnings you will achieve. But it's hard sometimes to have a benchmark as to what sort of velocity of experimentation you could be achieving, and therefore how much headroom you have to grow your experimentation program. And test capacity is a pretty simple calculation that lets us work out how many tests we can be running on our website on any given time. So the way that we work it out is to look at two different things, really. One of them is, how long is your average test taking to complete in weeks? And then dividing that into 52, which is essentially saying, if we could only run one test at a time, how many tests could we run over the course of an entire year? And then multiplying that by the number of simultaneously testable funnels or pages that you have, and that will give you the number of tests that you can run in a given year. So if each of your tests to your traffic levels was taking typically 5 weeks to complete, and you had 5 simultaneously testable funnels or pages, you'd have an annual capacity of 52 tests. So that's the starting point, is to understand how much you could be testing if you were running at peak efficiency, let's say. The second metric that you want to look at then is what percentage of that capacity you're actually making use of. And this is where we're talking about test velocity. So test velocity is essentially just how many tests we're running in a given period of time, let's say a month. And what we want to be evaluating is the difference between our velocity and our capacity, ideally closing that gap over time, again, provided that all else is equal with respect to the quality of the tests, that you're not launching poorer hypotheses because you're wanting to get more tests out the door. And by tracking this over time, you can get a good grasp of how your experimentation program is improving with respect to making use of the traffic that's on your website. Another great metric, particularly with organizations that are a bit newer to testing, is to have a giant red flag around the number of days since you had 0 experiments on your website. So I view traffic on your website that doesn't see or experience a test as a permanently missed opportunity. That visitor will never come back to your website in that frame of mind in order for you to leverage their visit in order to gain the learning. And so even if we say that our objective is to use as much of our testing capacity as possible, what we definitively do not want to do is to have 0 tests running at any point in time. And so this should be a key part of your dashboard for your program, let's say. Obviously, as I said, we want to make sure that the quality of our hypotheses is the same or improving over time, even as we're increasing the velocity of experimentation. And so one thing that you can look to do there is to calculate on an ongoing basis the rate at which your tests are winning, the rate at which you're getting inconclusive results, and the rate at which your tests or your hypotheses are losing. It's pretty self-explanatory, but what you'd be wanting to look at there, ideally, you see that your win rate is increasing because you're doing better research, your hypotheses are better founded in evidence or what have you, and that over time your loss rate is decreasing as well. Another thing to keep an eye on is how many variations you're launching per experiment. So it can be very tempting just to launch an A/B test that is only to have one variation in addition to the control. But there's actually research from Optimizely that experiments that have more variations, particularly those that have 4, 5, or 6 variations, have a much larger chance to produce a win, or at least an insight that is something that can help you to iterate. And so you should be keeping an eye on average, how many variations you're running per experiment, because if you're running less variations, then your experiments are more likely to lose. And so this is something also that you should be trying to have an upward trajectory with. So basically, these KPIs collectively help you understand where within your optimization program you need to focus efforts to improve results. So if you have a fantastic win rate, but your test velocity is very low relative to your capacity, then perhaps you should be going to your leadership within your organization and asking for more resources in order to double down on the results you're seeing, and so on. Another area that can be very fruitful in terms of optimizing an experimentation program and getting more experiments out the door is to look at what processes you can put around experimentation that support innovation, and particularly efficient innovation. Because ultimately we want to be trying to get as much revenue as possible from this experimentation with as little input in terms of effort as possible. So some of the things that you can do in order to put those processes into place are, for example, to develop a robust QA checklist so that each time an experiment is going through the process of implementation, you can ensure that you've ticked every single box as far as making sure that that experiment is ready to go to market. Another is to make sure that you don't have a fragmented approach to managing your pipeline of tests, that you're using a Trello board, for argument's sake, a Jira board, some form of Kanban, in order to provide and have visibility over where each experiment is in the pipeline. Of course, as well, we should have a standardized way in which we report, analyze, and communicate the results of each experiment so that other people within your organization can leverage the insights that you gained, not just yourself, and so that they can deploy those learnings and insights in order to improve the quality of their own work output. So the sorts of questions you should always be looking to establish or answer when you are completing a template around post-test analysis would be, of course, what was the hypothesis actually, and probably also what evidence did you use in order to develop that hypothesis? Where did you actually run the test? Did it win or lose? Conducting good quality journey analysis to determine what behaviors you actually influenced, even if the test did lose. And looking, of course, at whether there were any segmentation within the test audience that over or underperformed, because that can give you some nuggets that allow additional iteration. Basically, these repeatable processes, as I said, mean that you can do more with less. And if you're able to do more with less, then even without additional resource investments, you'll be getting more experiments out the door. So another factor in how successfully we can drive an optimization program is the quality of idea generation and how much of it we're able to have. So if we are just perhaps acting on our own in order to try and determine some hypotheses as to how the website should be changed, then we probably have a finite capacity as to how many problems we can identify and how many solutions, therefore, we can hypothesize. And so some ways in which you can look to scale the rate at which you're generating new ideas about how to change your website is basically to maximize how many different information sources you have your hands on in order to create more leverage on this process of defining the problems that you should be looking to fix. One underrated but fantastically useful set of stakeholders within an organization as it relates to website testing is customer service teams. At Ratio, we are massive believers in solving for the customer. We think that if we can make the customer journey easier, if we can reduce friction, if we can answer the questions they have that aren't being answered at the moment, then we have a very good chance of converting more of them. It's a very reliable technique that we find for understanding what the problems are with the experience that need to be fixed. And the best way in order to understand what problems customers are having to fix them, of course, is to ask customers directly, which we'll talk about in a moment. But another fantastic way is to talk to people within the organization that are already close to the customer. As marketers, I think we can often be guilty of having our own assumptions about how customers are experiencing the website that we're putting in front of them. And oftentimes assumptions are not correct because they're not based in evidence. Customer service teams, sales representatives, they are talking to your customers on a daily basis. Your customers are probably already expressing frustrations to those people about what it is about the experience that made them call up on the phone rather than completing the checkout process, where they found an error within the journey that prevented them from transacting online. And so if you can tap into the customer service teams and even ask them if they already have any reporting around what the common inquiry types are that they're receiving, you will have a fantastic source of ideas as to how your website can be improved. We are also massive believers at Ratio in using quantitative data, not just qualitative data, in order to determine what needs to be changed and where. And so what we do for our clients is to build, first to determine what the key journeys are on their website, and then to build dashboards that provide real-time visibility over how the funnel is performing for those key segments. So here we have in Adobe Analytics using Workspace, we've created a dashboard for a bank that we're working with, which is showing how many visitors, obviously not provided the real number, but how many visitors saw a top level category page, how many of those saw a second level category page, how many of those saw a third level page, which is a product page, and how many of those actually converted. And from that, we can ascertain where the biggest drop-off points are within that journey. This could be changed up if it's the case that users are typically actually entering onto a second level category page, then perhaps you would start it at this point and specify instead that the starting point of the funnel is actually an entry onto the second level page. But once you've conducted some thorough journey analysis and understand the typical patterns of engagement that users take throughout your website, then by having these funnels in front of you, you immediately have a good idea of where you can create the most leverage in terms of trying to fix these issues. And the other thing to do when you're conducting this sort of journey analysis is to apply additional segmentation that can let you determine not just where the issues are, but for who the issues are present. And so here I'm breaking down that funnel by month, but I could just as easily have device type there, marketing channel, day of week, time of day. Any of those data points might give us a better understanding about the type of visitors that are having challenges at any given step of the funnel. And while that doesn't get us all of the way there in terms of determining what the solution should be In fact, it doesn't get us all of the way there, even in terms of determining what the problems are that those users are having. At that point, we can start to overlay some of the qualitative data, and we'll have a very thorough understanding of where there are problems that need to be fixed. We are massive advocates of, as I said, talking to customers directly about what their experience is like on your website, and understanding from customers directly where there are problems that need to be fixed. So a couple of things about this that I would encourage you to consider. The first is that oftentimes when we're running, let's say, surveys using Hotjar, Qualaroo, or some other similar tool, the temptation can be to run the surveys on pages that are earlier in the funnel, and ask about the experience of visitors on those pages, where typically you will have more volume. The issue with that is that you're actually not just asking questions about the experience of users that are qualified, you're collecting information from users that never would have bought and perhaps were never qualified to buy your product or use your service in the first instance. And so how we like to view this is instead to survey and ask questions of people who completed the purchasing process, and ask those people about what moments of friction existed in their experience that almost stopped them from buying. As in this example just here, what's the one thing that nearly stopped you from buying from us? Because there we have a set of people that we know definitively are actually qualified users, a relevant audience of your product. And by asking them what almost stopped them from buying, we can be sure that we'll be identifying problems that that are actually relevant to an audience of people who were qualified but didn't buy. Post-purchase surveys, that is sent out via email as opposed to in short survey pop-ups on the website, are also a fantastic source of information about where and how experiences can be fixed, or even beyond that, understanding how customers view your value proposition, what the journey was like that they went through prior to purchasing with you, so that you can understand where that's weak or where you have strength in your value proposition that isn't necessarily being highlighted at the moment. So you could ask them in a post-purchase survey, for example, what competitive set were you comparing our product against before you purchased with us? Why did you choose to purchase with us over and above those competitors? And questions like that will really give you some valuable insight, perhaps about how you can change even the copy on your pages in order to convert more visitors. And I guess the thing to say there is that as it relates to scaling your optimization program, these sorts of research methods don't just give ideas, they are automatable, and therefore themselves pretty scalable. So you can have these sorts of surveys there running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without needing to invest any effort yourself, and over time just continue to get greater and greater insight and more information about where pain points are that can be corrected. What we like to do at Ratio, once we've identified problems with the user experience, the customer experience, is not to ourselves jump directly to what the solutions should be, but to engage a wider stakeholder group within the organization in order to map solutions to each of the problems that we've identified through that qualitative and quantitative research process. This has a couple of benefits. The first is that, generally speaking, the broader the cross-section of people that are thinking about how to solve a given problem, the better the quality of the solutions that the group can devise. But also, one of the factors in the scalability of your optimization program is how bought into what you're doing other people within your organization are. And if you are engaging other people within marketing, engaging your sales team, engaging your customer service team in a process of identifying what solutions should be brought to bear against these problems, they're going to be much more bought into and invested in what you're doing. And you're also going to start to almost evangelize this process of test and learn in order that they can start to apply some of these techniques to their own work. Once we have a set of solutions to a set of problems that we have confidence actually exist, they're not just ones that we've imagined or assumed existed, we need to be pretty ruthless with how we prioritize which solutions we implement, again, with a view to spending our finite resources from an optimization perspective as efficiently as possible. Now, there are a number of frameworks out there that can help you to do this, and they're not very complicated to use. This one that's on the screen is called the PI framework from an organization called Wider Funnel. And PI is essentially looking at each experiment on the basis of 3 factors. So we have what is the potential of that idea to drive an impact. We have a factor like ease, which is how easy it is to actually implement, and that could be on the basis of not only from a technical perspective, how much development time it's going to need, but also things like, is this running a bit contrary to what we would normally do from a brand perspective, in which case some ideas can be harder to implement from an organizational buy-in point of view. And in any case, by using a framework like this and by evaluating each solution against a set of factors as objectively as possible, we can actually understand which idea is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck if we implement it. So another thing that we need to look at doing in order to scale experimentation within our organization is to look at how we can move this idea of testing beyond our own team and start to influence more of a culture of test and learn throughout the wider organization. Well, firstly, how do we even define what a test and learn culture is, and what attributes or qualities of your organizational culture are you trying to inspire, create, and put into place to support greater experimentation? And here are some of the ways that we view a successful test and learn culture. So firstly, that the organization understands the importance of data-driven decision-making, and not even data-driven decision-making, but evidence-driven decision-making, as I said, as it can include information and qualitative research. That where there's uncertainty or risk, the organization or the people within it understand that experimentation is a good way in order to address that risk. That people understand how it is that you go about designing an experiment in terms of the insights that go into it, or what a good hypothesis looks like, what a null hypothesis is, and so on. And that people within the organization are given leverage, not leverage, I should say, but given the ability to fail sometimes, because the reality is that that experimentation is not a miracle tonic that will mean that every single change that we make is successful. Experimentation in its very nature acknowledges that sometimes we won't be successful. Of course, you could also say that through not experimenting, it's likely that there'll be changes that are unsuccessful. It's just when you do experiment, you know about it so that you can roll back those changes. So some of the ways in which we can look to get experimentation out there into the wider organization are to look at how you can help, for example, the product team within your organization with their work, and how experimentation can be embedded into their workflow. So just a couple of examples to highlight would be that oftentimes the product team themselves will have a hypothesis as to an improvement, a new feature that could be made that would improve the customer experience, that would increase utilization of your website, whatever metric you're looking at. And one way you can support them, for example, is by doing a painted door experiment. So in a previous life, I worked at an e-commerce company in Australia, and our product team were looking at building a feature like a wish list and a favoriting feature, and that would have been quite an expensive feature to build from the point of view of investment and development resources. So what we did before actually building that was, on the product listing pages on our website, we used a client-side A/B testing tool to insert a little love heart into the product images in one of the corners. And then we used an analytics tool in order to evaluate how often customers were clicking that love heart. What that did was help us understand that if customers thought that there was such a wish list or favoriting mechanism, would they actually engage with it? And what we found was that, in fact, when we ran this so-called painted door test, not many users actually did try and engage with that wish list functionality. So we were able to avoid the expense of building the thing by running a quick test up front to see whether it would actually be engaged with. Of course, then we should be helping our product team when they do actually build a feature and roll it out to conduct a stage rollout, perhaps to roll it out to a small percentage of the website audience first, in order to determine if there are any problems that should be addressed. So there are a number of ways in which you can support even just this one team, the product team, with using experimentation to do a better job of continuing to build the product. A great case study around this is the website Booking.com, which may not be doing so well at the moment, but in general are really at the top of their game in the travel and tourism sector from the point of view of their conversion rates. And Booking.com, their entire culture is built around experimentation. In fact, every single new piece of code that goes live onto their website is tested. They're running on a daily basis hundreds of tests, or launching hundreds of tests, in order to quickly validate the ideas that they have. Their point of view is that you should be looking to test on the nanoscale. That is, not to redesign an entire page and have uncertainty around which parts of your redesign worked or didn't work, but to break all of the changes you could be looking to make into their component parts and test them one by one. Of course, they also have the virtue of millions upon millions of visitors, which is perhaps not a luxury that everyone has in order to test with. But we can definitely learn something from their approach to experimentation. And in fact, their conversion rates, according to some research, are 2 to 3 times the industry average. And this would be put down to the culture that they built around experimentation. Another thing to consider is the operating model you're using from an experimentation point of view. And there are a few different operating models you can consider just as a starting point in terms of how your team should interact with and affect experimentation throughout the organization. So the first, which is probably where most people start, is a center of excellence. And that is where there's a centralized team in the organization that are controlling and driving forward all of the experimentation that happens. So that one team is the team that's establishing all of the processes, all of the documents, all of the guidelines. They're the ones that build and execute upon the only optimization roadmap throughout the organization. But the risk of this sort of model is in that you lose perhaps the ability to influence other teams in the organization that could also leverage experimentation as effectively as you might if you're engaging them better in the process. There are also models that some organizations are using where, which is quote unquote a distributed resource model. And that is where, rather than having one centralized team that's driving experimentation, they have experimentation resources, specialists, or what have you, embedded within each team, division, or location. And the benefit there is that those experimentation specialists are much closer to the truth in terms of the priorities, strategic objectives, and processes of the teams they're trying to support. But the drawback is that when things are massively decentralized like that, it's harder to have it's harder to keep everyone aligned around a clear and integrated experimentation strategy. So kind of the middle ground between those two models that a lot of organizations look to adopt is a hub and spoke model. And that is where there is still a central contact or team that are really driving optimization forward from the point of view of what does best practice look like, what are the guidelines that we should put around this, what tools are we using and why. But then there's also resources within the teams that could leverage experimentation, like the product teams, who are staying close to the ground there, so to speak, in terms of what needs to happen on a more granular level. And so this is a kind of a hybrid approach which shares the best parts of both the Center of Excellence and distributed resource models. Obviously, any of these kind of operating models for an optimization team need to be adapted to the needs of your organization. Just to speak briefly about one that we put into place for a global bank that we're working with, is to, and a bit of context first, is that this is a large bank that has multiple different markets that each control their own website, that each have different levels of maturity from an experimentation and optimization point of view, and that also have different levels of traffic, different objectives and so on. And we're also working with them from a development point of view. So we split up these regions within each of within the bank into 3 different groups. The first one is we're called experiment labs. Experiment labs are really the linchpin of the experimentation process. So if we have a strategy for a new feature that we want to develop, that's where we use A/B testing in order to validate that that's actually a good decision to make. As new features go live within those experiment labs, those are the markets in which we test the new features in order to determine what does effective rollout of that particular feature look like, and in order that we can build that into an optimal rollout plan that can communicate it to other markets. Of course, there are markets that want to be involved but don't necessarily have, let's say, the resource or the traffic availability in order to directly support testing. And so what we also have is a second level down, which is a set of research partners, which are markets where we are engaging them in the research process as we're determining what a product development, a new product feature should look like, in order to understand what their requirements are, get them to complete surveys that can help us understand where their problems or pain points are as it relates to the website. And then we have markets that don't have the resources even to be involved from that point of view. And these we call our delivery heroes. And our delivery heroes are those that rapidly take advantage of the rollout plan that we've developed with the experiment labs. So this is kind of a blended approach that we've used to great success with this banking client that we're working with. And yeah, so consider how you can look at spreading experimentation within your organization and what model it is in particular that is most appropriate given your specific circumstances. An interesting case study here is from the Royal Bank of Scotland. So they have this program that they've run for some years now, starting in 2015, called the Superstar DJ program, and they've deliberately called it the Superstar DJ program to keep it as lighthearted as possible, and to keep it interesting and fun for people who aren't typically involved in experimentation to be as interested as possible. So just in terms of the success that they've seen from running this program, in 2014, I guess in the first half of 2014, they only had 2 optimization specialists within the bank, and they'd only managed to complete 2 tests. By 2015, so let's say at most a year and a half later, they had 50 optimization specialists, and they'd completed 400 tests. So they had more than 200x the velocity of their experimentation program. A couple of the ways that they did this, the operating model that they selected as a single market website, let's say, is that they split their website journey up into a number of different component parts. So let's say there was the application flow, internet banking, product listing pages for credit cards, product listing pages for transactional accounts, and so on. And they hired a journey manager or an optimization specialist who was solely focused on generating ideas around that specific journey. Now, another thing that they did is to look at how they could use communication as a way to get and maintain buy-in of other people within the organization around what they're doing. So a couple of the notes that they've made here is like that they're sending weekly communications to highlight the successes and learnings. They're keeping it fun and lighthearted, which is important so that it's not just a long wall of text to email that people don't want to engage with. And they've also used gamification to some success in order to promote competition, like, for example, by getting people to brainstorm ideas throughout the organization, and then using charts or leadership boards to show whose ideas have been the most successful, or who had the most ideas that were ultimately implemented. The final thing that I want to talk about, which is a really important one when it comes to getting buy-in and ultimately additional resources into your optimization program, is actually determining the return on investment of the optimization program as a whole. And I'm going to talk about two ways in which this is done, and one of them is in our view certainly not what organizations should be doing, but it is actually the most common one. So most clients that we start to work with, when they are trying to provide information to the board on the success of their optimization program over the course of, let's say, a year, or even when they're trying to demonstrate the commercial return from any one individual experiment, looking at the conversion improvement that they're finding in their testing platform and applying that conversion improvement to the annual revenue or number of conversions that the website is making, or at least the amount of that annual revenue that would be affected by the journey that was tested. And saying that the conversion increase that was seen can be said to have, or can be predicted to drive an equivalent revenue uplift over the course of the entire year. Now, there are a number of problems with doing it in this way. The first is that, for example, there can be things like a novelty bias, where experiments that win by a lot to start with, actually over time, the difference between the conversion rate of the control and the conversion rate of the variation that's been implemented starts to decrease, or in other words, the uplift is smaller over time than you would have expected if you were looking at what the improvement was at the time that you stopped the test. Another problem is that it assumes that all else will be equal throughout the year. And so, for example, where perhaps this change that you've made that has been successful was quite successful in April, the beliefs, motivations, journeys of visitors who are on the website in December would be very different. And therefore, it's actually not valid to say that the uplift that you've got now could be said to apply 9 months down the line. And I think what you would see probably if you did this for every one of your tests is that you would be reporting a impact of your experimentation program that far outweighs any difference to the bottom line in terms of growth that your organization is actually seeing through the website year on year. And even on that level, if you are saying that your conversion rate through all the testing has increased by 50%, and yet when you look at the overall site conversion rate, it's only increased by 5 or 10%, you can see that the math just simply not stack up. And people with your organization, like your chief financial officer, will be very, they'll not be impressed by by this sort of methodology in terms of determining the results of your program. Far from it, they'll be quite suspicious about the results that you're reporting, and they'll come knocking. So the gold standard actually for determining the impact of an experimentation program in order to try and win more budget and resources to take it further is to use holdout groups. So holdout groups are basically that we have on our website a percentage of the audience that never at any point in time become exposed to any experiments whatsoever. So this could be done via random allocation of a cookie value to a certain percentage of your visitors, and always excluding that users with that cookie value from your audience test group when you're running experiments, or there could be other more technical ways that you go about doing it. And the way in which you use these holdout groups is to look at the overall conversion rate after a period of time. 12 months is a very popular one for the holdout group. Look at the overall conversion rate for the parts of the audience that actually were exposed to experiments, and calculate the difference between the two. And that is more or less the impact that you could attribute to your CRO program. And one, undoubtedly, that will be a far smaller impact than you would have reported if you were simply adding up all of the uplifts that you got from individual tests. But it is a far more robust method of working out what sort of impact you're making. It will be far better trusted by people within the organization once they understand your methodology, and you have a much better chance of leveraging this sort of information in order to get more resources, to expand your team, and to do even more testing. So that's it for today's webinar. Are there any questions?
Let me just check, Doug. If you want to ask Doug a question, just pop it in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your of the screen, and we can answer the question now. So give me a second, Doug. I'll just check if any questions are coming through. Looks like. Okay. Yes, Doug, I do have a question from Jack. If you just give me 1 second, we'll just read out the question. If a test is released to the production site, how does that affect the holdout groups?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I guess what you're saying there, Jack, is if you, let's say, are using a third-party testing tool in order to effect a change, and in that third-party testing tool, you have a holdout group, but then you're taking the change and actually applying it with your content management system. And the answer is that I would actually need to develop your content management system so it continues to serve the original experience to users within the holdout group. So it's a non-trivial problem, that's for sure, but it is a much more robust way of actually knowing the impact that you've made.
Cool. We've got time for, I think, one more question. So we'll give everyone just a second to write a question in. Okay, Doug, doesn't look like we have any more questions for today.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for your time. And if you do have any other questions that arise after the webinar, we'll send out an email with contact details so you can get in touch. Thank you very much, everyone.